So you wrote, I guess it was a couple of years ago now, that Facebook was a right-wing company of sorts, and I want to talk about the sort of the personality of Facebook, and then broaden out to really less about whether what the political orientation of Facebook is, at least in terms of the way that we measure these things, right and left, and more as an entity and how it has. How it influences our society, and also how it skews our politics in a broader sense. But let's start with that. What makes Facebook a right-wing company in your mind?
I think you have to look at a couple different elements of the company. One is simply a matter of leadership. Now, Silicon Valley is often identified as a liberal or sort of libertarian-leaning place. I think personally that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't really have firm political commitments. I think he's most concerned about growing Facebook and the survival and success of Facebook. But I think if you look at some of the people around him, especially on the level of policy, you have Joel Kaplan, who's I believe his title is VP of Global Policy or something of that nature. He is famous for sitting behind Kavanaugh at his confirmation hearing. He's a well-known former Republican operative, and is become sort of the policy level decision maker at Facebook, along with Sheryl Sandberg. So I think then if you saw what happened over the last few years of the Trump administration, really Facebook was often bending over backwards to accommodate conservatives, both prominent ones like someone like Ben Shapiro, who Mark Zuckerberg met with privately, or the president himself. Obviously, we have finally Trump banned from Facebook. But in fact, if you look at the relationships it cultivates and sort of the politics it maintains as an organization, I think it's safe to say that Facebook leans rather conservative.
Now, every company has I guess, every individual as a company has the right to be, conservative or liberal or radical, whatever they want to be, I guess, on some level. But from a structural standpoint, there's a real problem with Facebook, regardless of what its political orientation is. And I think, obviously, during a Republican administration, it would be surprising if they weren't sort of kowtowing and hedging their bets in that way. And to a certain extent, I imagine they're going to be doing that from a Democratic administration as well. But I think people I've spoken to say the same as you, is that Zuckerberg is interested in one thing, and that is massive growth, relentless growth for Facebook. How does just that agenda alone, how does that implicate our society?
Yeah, you could trace a lot of Facebook's problems and sort of the identity of the site from this notion of growth and of perpetual growth and scale, which really has a place of great significance in Silicon Valley, but especially for a company like Facebook. So look at something like the news feed, which presents information to Facebook users. The idea for the news feed also is that it keeps you engaged for as long as possible. So what you have is a series of recommendations of articles and groups and things like that will be served up to people. What Facebook has found is that more divisive content, especially content that kind of leans right-wing and rather inflammatory, whether it's sort of pro-Trump news or even militia content, that kind of thing can really keep people engaged and keep people on the platform. So what you have is kind of this automated recommendation machine that keeps steering people farther and farther towards more extreme viewpoints in the interest of scaling the site and scaling people's activity.
Well, what about that notion of all we're doing is delivering what people want?
Well, there is something to that in that at least you shape your experience a little bit, but there are a couple problems with that. One is you don't really know to what extent you shape your own experience. We don't know exactly how these platforms work, how the algorithms operate. You know that sometimes you click something here and you see a little bit more of it later. But then the other problem is, again, how people seem to be steered in a particular direction. There have been some studies and investigations that people have done at various journalistic outlets where they don't really like, or they don't sign up for any material willingly, but then they just go on Facebook and see what they're exposed to and recommended almost organically over time. And you still see this tendency to push people towards the right or towards sort of right-wing associations and misinformation.
That's interesting. I mean, and that reflects what we see in terms of right-wing, I guess, rhetoric in our society and other mediums tends to draw more consumers. I mean, in part because that's what right-wingers like to consume that more exclusively, I think. And then I think there's also this sort of like rubbernecking that folks who don't necessarily identify as conservatives do. I mean, that's, right? That was the story of Rush Limbaugh. I mean, we see that largely with like Fox News. Conservatives will exclusively consume very conservative content. And everyone else sometimes will look because it seems so crazy and they want to watch it. I mean, isn't that seems to be part of it too?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Also, you find some sort of traditional left-right divides breaking down on Twitter, on Facebook, especially in sort of the miasma of misinformation and boomer memes and all those other things that kind of swirl around there. But there is also a sense in which I think the right-wing media ecosystem is a lot more developed and sort of a coherent entity from Fox News and Sinclair on down. And some of that manifests itself really on Facebook too, where you have a lot of very established conservative and right-wing media brands do quite well on Facebook. And so whether that's a product of sort of deliberate effort and engineering, or whether that's more a reflection of the appetite out there for conservative material, I think the result is still that if you look at lists of the most shared material on Facebook, it tends to be people like, Dan Bongino, I believe is his name, Ben Shapiro, and various Fox News personalities.
All right, I want to get to the story you wrote about Facebook's conflict recently with Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is indicative of a big problem that we have with Facebook, and what ultimately leads you to write stuff like ban Trump, yes, and then break Facebook up. And we will talk about that. But so let's talk about this conflict with Australia. What was the conflict about initially?
So Australia was looking at its sort of news media ecosystem and saw, like a lot of other democracies and countries around the world, that it's been pretty harmed by Facebook and Facebook's absorption of the entire advertising market. So essentially, the Australian government...
Let me just stop you there, because explain what you mean by that, with the absorption of the advertising market, because I'm not sure that people fully appreciate just what has happened to the internet, and frankly, I guess periodicals as well, and for a long time, video, because of Facebook.
Sure. Yeah. Pardon me if I was skipping ahead there. So essentially, a lot of the digital advertising market is a duopoly between Facebook and Google, and traditional revenue streams for newspapers and magazines and other periodicals was advertising in one form or another, first print advertising, then digital advertising. But unfortunately, Facebook is pretty good at targeted advertising, or at least by industry standards. And it's really become a dominant player in all digital advertising, where most of the money now just simply goes to the coffers of Facebook and Google. And that's in turn harmed a lot of the business model of media, but also the incentives of media, which is generally to chase whatever makes them popular on Google and Facebook.
And it's not just a function of they're better at it. Their size, their sheer size, gave them an unfair competitive advantage. And to the extent that they had any competition, they would simply buy them up.
That's true. Facebook and Google have both made a lot of big purchases of competitors over the years, and they both have an instinct to sort of nab competitors before they really emerge. Facebook, even for a while, had an app where they tracked users' internet usage and phone usage to see what other apps that they were using, so that they could spot future competitors before they emerged. So there's a lot of kind of business intelligence going on here, a lot of sense that they want to undermine competitors before they even really have a chance to challenge them.
Right, and that is that undermining of competition in that way, as a function of the data you're hoovering up, or the market share that you have at the current time. That certainly, there's a lot of people who feel, runs afoul of if not the way that we've executed antitrust laws in the past 40 years, certainly the spirit of the antitrust laws, and certainly would have prior to Ronald Reagan and Robert Bork changing the way that we interpret the antitrust there. Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.